Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Growth Summit. We hope you're well rested and ready for another interesting day. We're going to start off with a view from the funders, if you will, from those who have a financial interest in promoting this agenda. And to lead the discussion, we have Emily Olson from Open Philanthropy. So I give the floor to Emily.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to the second day. I wanted to thank everyone again for coming, and then take an opportunity again to thank our illustrious hosts, CGG, CCI, and growth teams. I also wanted to take a quick moment to say thanks to the full CGG team who's putting on this event. It takes a tremendous amount of work to make something like this happen, and so I just wanted to call out Mark, Nicole, Charlie, Jeremy, Sarah, and Ava, and so just wanted to have a quick round of applause for everything they put into this. Great, thanks. So to give you a sense of this panel, I'm going to talk for a few minutes and give you an introduction to myself and some of the work that my organization does. And then I'm going to turn it over to the excellent panel that we have here. They're each going to talk for 7 to 10 minutes. Then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the group so that you can ask questions. So please be thinking about what you want to ask over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. To give a brief introduction, so my name's Emily Olson. I'm a managing director at a funder called Open Philanthropy. We give away about $800 million per year across a range of areas, science and biomedical R&D targeted at neglected diseases, research and policy advocacy across a range of topics like air quality and lead poisoning, work to mitigate risks from AI and biosecurity, among many other topics. I think to quote Arvind from earlier, we are a nano organization with nano resources and sometimes focus on some nano interventions, but we're expanding our work, and as of a couple days ago, we launched a program officer search focused on economic growth in low and middle income countries, so I'll come back to that in a little bit. But we're really excited to be doing more in this area. I'm particularly gratified to be here to learn from all of you, and then particularly to learn from this panel who's been doing this work for much longer than me. So at Open Philanthropy, we often think about problems or areas where we might direct grant-making resources across 3 dimensions. So the first is importance, how many people are affected by a given problem and how much. Tractability, how much progress can we make with a marginal increase in resources. And then neglectedness, how many other dollars are flowing to the problem, especially philanthropic dollars, and where can we find a neglected niche. And so I won't say very much about the first topic, importance. I think Lant covered it very well, among others, yesterday. But I wanted to add one comparison that's particularly stood out for me. So at Open Phil, we have a standard methodology for comparing health benefits and income benefits. And according to our own welfare comparison, accelerating growth, to take one example, the Philippines, to Chinese rates over the period from 1980 to 2023 would have had the same impact in our own terms as eliminating malaria globally over that same period. And so that's an extreme outcome, but I think it helps fix the idea that actually supporting more rapid growth has the potential to be deeply transformative at a really unbelievable scale. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about tractability and neglectedness. So we've been looking into what we could do on economic growth for a really long time. I think the co-founders of Open Philanthropy started talking to Lant about prioritizing economic growth in low and middle income countries before Open Phil even had its name in 2012. And so the big question has always been, what can we do about it? Are there tractable interventions where we can really make progress? And so our research team has spent time over the last several years looking into this question, investigating the literature, looking into potential grants, interviewing experts. We've also commissioned a number of reports from, I think, everyone from someone who is in this room today, asking them for specific ideas of what we could fund. And we're really far from definitively answering the question, but I wanted to share a few examples of things that have made us optimistic that we can find specific places to deploy money cost effectively. And so the first is in 2023, we gave support to Arvind to give economic policy advice in Tamil Nadu, which, as everyone knows, has a population of 76 million people. And so Arvind has been advising the state on reforms to the energy sector and tax policy. We've also been advocating for the renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, here in the US. And again, I think most people know what this is, but AGOA was initially passed in 2000, and it gives sub-Saharan African countries duty-free access to the US market for a range of products, and in particular apparel. And so research by Arvind and Justin, who I don't think is here today, suggests that AGOA significantly raises exports for eligible countries, and it's set to expire in 2025. And so we're trying to collaborate with others to advocate for a strong renewal, the potential for additional provisions that would lead to export-oriented growth. So taking a step back, these are just two examples, and it's a big open question for us whether we're going to be able to find more. But after spending a chunk of research time over the last several years, we emerged optimistic that there are indeed concrete and promising opportunities for additional philanthropic funding. Coming back to the second topic I mentioned, neglectedness. So we're also interested in understanding, are there particular niches where open phil could complement other actors? So of course, economic growth is far from a neglected cause overall. For decades, organizations like the World Bank and IMF, aid agencies, private foundations, and then as we heard a lot yesterday, especially state and country governments have invested cumulatively hundreds of billions of dollars into this question, and it has never really left the agenda, as we discussed yesterday. And so what can open philanthropy add that's distinct? And so I think there are a few places that I'll hit quickly, but we're still very much in the learning stage on this question. And so the first is that we're comfortable taking risks, making bets with low ex-ante probabilities of success if the upside is high enough. The second is speed. Our budget is very small, but our grants typically take around a month to be approved, and we think that that compares favorably to some other actors in the space. And then the third is flexibility. We're less constrained in the grants that we can make, especially compared to bilaterals or multilaterals, and we can more easily support civil society organizations or policy advocates. And so we are launching a program in this area. We're looking for a program officer to lead the work. If we find someone great, we're going to commit $30 million over 3 years. And so if anyone's interested in applying or knows someone who's interested in applying, we'd be really grateful. I have two colleagues here, Rafa and Oliver, so please find me or them to chat about it. And we have lots of information on our website. Okay, so now I want to turn to this panel next to me. So they've been doing this work for much longer than Open Philanthropy, and so I'm really eager to learn from all of their experiences. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to each of them, or actually they all have their own mics, but I'll introduce each of them one by one. So Gargi Ghosh is the president of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation, where she leads international political and economic affairs. She oversees the foundation's relationship with governments, intergovernmental organizations, advocates, and philanthropic partners worldwide. Professor Anand Khan is the chief economist and director of analysis directorate at FCDO, and he's seconded from LSE and is a professor in the School of Public Policy there. Abe Selassie is the director of African development at the IMF, where he oversees operations and engagement in 45 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. And under his leadership, the IMF has disbursed $51 billion to support the post-pandemic recovery. And Devin Long is an investment associate at Bridgewater, where he's the co-head of investment implementation. He's a 2024 Millennium Fellow at the Atlantic Council and recently published a report for Bridgewater called Changing Sub-Saharan Africa's Growth Trajectory. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Gargi.
Thanks, Emily. It's great to go on the second day because I get to reflect on all the controversies from yesterday and still tee up questions for the rest of today to answer. So I was reflecting a lot on some of the themes and choice sets that came up yesterday and really racking my brain to think if any of that resonated with how we at the Gates Foundation had made our initial decisions about what to fund, why to fund, where to fund. And I don't think they do. And I suspect most institutions make funding decisions on a range of incentives and thought processes. So Gates is coming up on 25 years. I have not been there the whole time, but I actually did do a spell at the foundation in its very early days and feel connected to a lot of the origin stories. And for us, the origin story was much more personal than I think we talked about yesterday. As Bill and Melinda at that time were thinking about their philanthropy, they were seeing families around the world, in this country and internationally, stuck in poverty traps. And the question for them was, why is that happening? What can we do to help? And as they gathered experts like yourselves in different rooms around the world, the answers that came back were things like actually poor health bankrupts families and keeps them stuck in poverty. Poor education prevents families from getting on the ladder out of poverty. The endless struggle to put food on the table just to eat, let alone to engage in the market, keeps families stuck in poverty. And so those were the things that we started to invest in, not so much from a palliative approach, but from an innovation approach. is there a way to end malaria? Is there a way to create seeds that help farmers be more productive? Now, as someone who now tries to make sure our work connects to a broader development progress, at times to development theory, I would say what we've done is invest in what we believe are some of the drivers of growth: human capital, innovation, which Rachel talked about yesterday, women's labor force participation. And that story we feel very good about. I think the evidence is super strong that, you know, a dollar invested in health leads to $4 of economic growth, a bit more schooling leads to increased GDP. But we do have to confront the fact that that has not led, those individual drivers have not led to broad, sustained growth. And I think that is, for us, the first point of reflection. Second, why are we talking about growth now? We're talking about it because it's not happening. It has happened for much of the life of the foundation. We didn't need to talk about growth because Africa was rising. Aid budgets were growing. So I think today, I wouldn't want us to forget that the slowing growth in advanced industrial economies will have a huge impact on all the work we do. Just look at the news of France's aid budget cuts from earlier this week. Trade barriers we talked about briefly yesterday, but also, you know, the overhang of debt burden, the unwillingness of the international community to take action on that creates the conditions that will make growth harder. So point two for us, I think, is that the system isn't set up to deal, ironically, with low growth moments. We don't have great backup plans, safety nets, if you will, in international economic cooperation when ODA goes down, when debt is where it is today. And that's super important for us. Third, what are we thinking about now? How are we thinking about making progress? So, I guess first, we remain super committed to the drivers of growth that have defined us from the beginning. And I wouldn't want this conversation to suggest a swing away from investing in human capital, the importance of innovation. That will remain really important. We've added on to that investments in what I think of as the new infrastructure of growth. You heard yesterday the importance of digital inclusion. That's a huge area of focus for us. I think in the pandemic we saw the safety net benefits of that. We also believe digital connectivity, the digital stack will be an important driver of growth in the future. We continue to invest in innovation, not just in advanced industrial economies, but tens of millions of investment into the developing country vaccine manufacturing network to strengthen Indonesia, India, and vaccine supplier and the innovation ecosystem there. We'll do the same on AI in Africa. I do think there are a number of questions yet to be answered about future growth models. So I'm happy to be having this conversation in a research setting, because I don't think the growth prescriptions from 20 years ago, maybe even 15, 10 years ago, are exactly what will fit the bill today. I think so much has changed in a sustained way in labor markets, in job patterns, with technology, with AI, that we do need to refresh the thinking of the economics profession and more on growth. What I'd close with is just to say that for me, the most exciting investments, the most exciting conversations we're having now on growth actually aren't running through present conversation accepted, aren't running through Washington and London, but are actually happening in Jakarta and Singapore and Brasilia. And I think that ability now to think of the development story in a way that amplifies and mobilizes the middle-income country story, brings that more to low-income settings, is something we're very excited to invest in. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Khan.
Thank you. Really great to be here. So I completely agree with the major emphasis of this whole summit, the importance of growth and that we need to prioritize growth. The question is how. As far as the importance of growth, in the famous words of the Growth Commission, growth can lift people en masse from poverty and misery. Nothing else ever has. So the real question is, how do we do this? I remember in my ancestral village, when it first got electricity and road many, many years ago, I could see an instantaneous change in the aspirations of people. They could compare themselves with people in the first world, people in that case, how different are we from, say, people in Islamabad, they said. They have light, we have light. And within one generation, I could also see huge implications in terms of misallocation of human capital, in that people who were much smarter than me were starting to get into more productive jobs, who were stuck into jobs that were less productive, were immediately starting to get, within one generation, I could see that. And I think the key question is, nowhere in the world people do not prioritize growth. The question is how. The question is also for the international community to realize that the agency for growth and for development lies with the citizens and governments of those countries and not with us, not with people from the outside. Outside actors do have a role. I think the most important of those roles is do no harm. I think that's often said, not always respected, especially when it comes to questions of rigidity. Let me say a word about UK policy, and since you invited me on that one. UK FCDO, at different in the past, has, in my admittedly biased way, played a very important role in global development. With the current Labour government that we have, the new government that we have, and the currently highly fiscally constrained environment, they're rightly a focus on macro and policy stability. They're rightly a focus on growth in the UK also. But the language that we use, the expressions that are used, are very consistent with international growth and development, in that the focus is entirely on targeted and inclusive growth. That's also intellectually and morally consistent with the choices that UK is making internally. The FS has prioritized economic growth and development in Africa in particular as one of the top priorities. We're seeing lots more discussions going on. So Minouche Shafik, who many of you perhaps know, is leading a review of development where growth, I can't prejudge, but I know from the consultation that economic growth will play a very important role. And in preparation for that, like we're already doing a lot of work on inclusive growth diagnostics, on what different countries in different parts of the world need to do to promote growth, and how we as outside actors can support. But it's also a question of, like, it's not just the level of funding, it's also how we spend it. For UK, it is critically important that we catalyze our funding. We do catalytic investments in how and where we fund it. So partly, when it comes to level of funding, I think Ebe will say more about how developed countries and how we can sweat our assets at the IFIs, at the bank and the fund, in order to make more funding available for developing countries. I'll leave it to him to say. I'll leave it to Paddy to say more about, like, what UK is doing in terms of British international investment, catalytic investment in the rest of the world. I don't want to steal your thunder. So but what we're doing also is not just country-specific support, global public goods, and I'll come to some of those in a minute, but also supporting where we see windows of reform. And Stefan is here, so like where we see elite settlement, for pro-growth coalitions emerging, how do we support those? But it's also like where they do not exist, how can we still support through investing in the drivers for growth, through girls' education, women education, many other things that can still important for us to. What we're also doing is making some catalytic investments in sector-specific investment to enable structural transformation in many countries. One of them is Manufacturing Africa, where we're trying to promote more manufacturing in Africa. I think if I remember correctly, We have 100, in the last few years, we had 156 deals worth over $1 billion. I think about 36 of them have already reached financial close. So there's a lot of things that we're already doing. There are a lot more things that we could do, including in supporting governments, specific sectors, promoting exports, other areas. Let me end on one thing that was mentioned yesterday by my friend Arvind. So the nano aspect of research, which is, I personally find that language slightly unhelpful in the sense like I think what is important is high quality, good research on policy relevant questions. That could be a macro question, that could also be a micro questions. And we at FCDO fund all of those kinds of research. So Andy is here, he funds the growth research. We fund impact evaluation at the bank at the time when it was not prioritized by the bank itself. We fund macro research at the IMF for low-income countries. We fund all kinds of other research. We fund inclusive growth diagnostic. We fund organizations like the IGC who have like long-term in-country trustful relationship with the government in those countries that can supply governments with support on issues demanded by those governments. So what is important is, I think, high-quality, policy-relevant research. It could be macro, but it could also need to be your micro foundations, strong micro foundations. And whether it's narrowly in the category of growth research, I'm not entirely sure. So if you run a regression between the episodes of growth in the world and the contribution of growth researchers, I'm not sure we'll get a very significant result. So yes, growth has happened because of people like Manish and others, like private sector people, the market forces, by other actors. And yes, we need to devote more research on this one, but I'm not sure that research is only in the narrow area that some people think are growth relevant. Just to give you an example, so Karthik recently came up with a fantastic book on accelerating India's economic development. Great book, based on all kinds of areas on building state capacity. That's high-quality research on a fundamental, important macro growth question based on micro foundations. That's not nano research for me. So, give you another example. I worked for 8 years with the government on supporting, designing, helping with them, working with them on their public procurement policy research, public procurement reform. That's not nano research for me. So, I think what we need is good research on policy-relevant questions, on both macro and micro questions, which are connected to policymakers. So the best minds to work on the most important questions, connected to policymakers. So I see Leonard here. So Leonard's work is one of the most transformational that I've seen. That's not a nano research for me. So what we need is the best minds to work on the most important questions, connected to the world of policy actors in real time, where policy influencing doesn't come ex post after the research has been done, but in some ways like inbuilt ex ante. In other words, is endogenous policy influencing is endogenous to the production of high quality good research. So let me stop here.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here with you all this morning. You know, everybody's been invoking Arvind, so I want to also say that I had prepared notes like he had, but I can't help but react to what's being said by others, so I'm going to drift away a little bit from that. So, you know, on the point about growth, I mean, the main focus will be on the funding squeeze that we see going on, and I think what I see as a breakdown in the development finance architecture. I'll come to that later, but I wanted to comment a little bit on the growth story, particularly from an African perspective, and how I see this period that we've gone through from a period of very high growth in between 2000 and 2020 or so to right now where growth is very, very anemic. I think, you know, we are, first of all, I think, as always, kind of, there's not enough appreciation of the heterogeneity of country circumstances in the region. So this has been a period where we've had fantastic growth outcomes in quite a number of countries, but more so that we've had tremendous development progress. When I look at what has happened, I mean, this is a point that was made by Charles Kenny way back, but when you look at what has happened to life expectancy, to maternal mortality rates, child mortality rates, there's been tremendous progress. Huh? So this last 20 or so years where debt has gone up or other macro indicators, macro policy indicators have not been as well. There's not been a period that has been lost, even in countries where growth has been anemic. So that's the first point I want to make. Second, what was behind the strengths that we saw, which was a bit more general in that period? I want to just, put on the table three more meta considerations. One was it was a period of relative peace and stability. So, and countries, because the financing constraint was a bit more limited, were not going about creating policy-induced distortions. So, again, to quote Arvind, countries had stopped doing stupid shit, as it were. Okay. So that was minimal because the financing constraints were not there, and monetary printing, etc., had been minimized, etc. So just so that's an important factor that facilitated quite a bit of growth, or set a good backdrop for growth. Second one, of course, is the external environment. Gargi also touched on it. There was a lot of aid flows, but more so the fact that there was a lot of global growth and a lot of investment also flowing to the region. It was a period where the borrowing, financing costs were relatively lower. So that, I think, did contribute to the period of high growth. So, and we shouldn't underestimate this, how important the global environment was in terms of creating conditions for countries to grow, investment to flow to the region. And then the third meta factor also, which I think continues to weigh on growth, or the development challenge that countries face, is demographics. I cannot help but think, the more I've been traveling around the world, beyond the region, and looking at economic history, just how much of what we see now as these periods of growth and then associate them automatically to good policies was also partly driven by things like the demographic dividend, the demographic waves that countries have been going to. And right now in Africa, the dependency ratio is extremely high. You have a lot of young people, outside the workforce, and the amount of investment countries have to make, the youth bulge that's coming. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing huge challenges, as governments have to spend quite a bit of money on that, but also just the fact that the share of the working age population relative to total population is not as high, and as that improves, things will turn. Now, turning to funding squeeze that countries are facing, and how the last 4 or 5 years have played out, and something that we've, of course, been trying to work and defray as much as we can as an institution. I'm struck by because we're a little bit at the coalface in terms of the work that we do as an institution. We're the ones that go to, that governments turn to when they have this financing problem, and we have to go and help them think through the budget, what may be affordable, what is not, what the macroeconomic consequences of pushing the boat out would be. It really has been distressing to see. We talk a lot about the SDGs and how governments need to improve, all the indicators in there about, teacher to student ratios, etc. Right now, we are working with countries in the Sahel, but also other countries. The Sahel is particularly financing constrained, but other countries like Malawi, etc., in more peaceful conditions, where ministers do not have enough resources to maintain real per capita spending for education, in real terms. That is the kind of funding squeeze we're talking about. This is a function, of course, of aid flows having declined, not sufficient counter-cyclical financing being provided to them by institutions like mine, the World Bank. And last but not least, a squeeze that has taken place where an increasing share of resources is having to be devoted to interest payment. And of course, these kids that are going to be given the demographic transition that's taking place globally, the demographic dynamics that's taking place, these are the kids that are going to be powering the global economy going forward. 1 out of every 2 new entrants into the global labor force will be coming from sub-Saharan Africa going from 2030, 2035 onwards. And we're not doing anything to improve education outcomes in the region as an international community. Yeah? Governments are doing what they can to manage this challenge. But it's, I think, beyond them. So the first point I want to make is, no matter how much money IMF, World Bank put on the table, the only way we can avoid austerity, the only way we can actually make a difference in development outcomes is for the international community to rally and put more resources in. So one plea I have is to not accept what is happening in advanced countries as a given. Much as, in the 90s and the early 2000s, it wasn't the case that we were going to see the Glen Eagles moment that we did, etc. So I think there's a bit of fatalism about the direction of aid budgets, the direction of concessional financing from abroad, and I think it's really important is to put the counter narrative and the consequence of that is out there. Second point I wanted to make, and again, reacting a little bit to Adnan, is, in the region and with policymakers, there is, just do not underestimate how much they relate development progress, growth outcomes to more investment in hard infrastructure, more investment in education, in health, because that's their day-to-day lives. We have increasingly boisterous democratic dispensation in the region, and governments have to deliver. Governments have to deliver to be able to stay in power and to carry the population with them. And the other reason why I worry about the moment is that I increasingly see policymakers drifting away from engagement with the international community, because we're not coming up with answers as to what's going to unlock growth, but more importantly, development outcomes. So again, I think there's there's a need to reflect deeply about how we engage with governments, because without, we have to be humble. We cannot make a difference in countries without engaging with governments directly. And that's the other point I wanted to put on the table. Lastly, I want to also inject a little point of optimism, as it were. I went back to my country in 1992 as a 26-year-old and to work for government. I'm Ethiopian, and that was 2-3 years after the country had just come through a wrenching civil war and big government change. And I, every time I go back to Addis or the other countries that I got to travel with when I was working for government, to Ghana, to Uganda, 34 years later, I'm struck by how much transformation there has been in those countries. And if you had asked me in early 90s, if that would be possible, I would have said, what are you talking about? But there has been deep and lasting transformation, and I think going forward also we shouldn't be too pessimistic about what is going to be possible for the region. So just want to end on that note. Thanks.
Over to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, CGD. It's really it's a pleasure to be here. I thought maybe I'd start quickly with just giving a little bit of context about my organization and sort of what are we doing, why are we here today. And then I want to talk a little bit about from the lens of private investors such as ourselves and the clients we represent. What do we sort of see as the big barriers to investing in low-income countries? I'm going to use sub-Saharan Africa mostly as the region I talk about because that's where our research is focused. And sort of what do we see as the ingredients needed for the private sector to come in at scale. So just some quick background. So, Bridgewater Associates is a global asset manager. Our sort of flagship strategy is a global macro hedge fund style strategy, although we have other things as well. Our clients are kind of the large major pools of capital in the world. So sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. And our approach is very much small number of clients, but big mandates and deep relationships. And we really seek to partner with these major pools of capital and understand them and serve them. And I'd say earlier this year, we sort of launched an initiative that I've led to try to understand economic development more and understand sub-Saharan Africa as a region more, which obviously plays today a relatively small role in global economies, a relatively small share of global GDP, relatively small share of global capital markets, and commensurate with that is a relatively small share of what we do and what we invest in. But we're very interested in how that could change in the coming decades. There's obviously a demographic aspect to that story. To the extent it's paired with a pickup in productivity growth, there's at least the potential that 3 decades from now, the world looks very different, and we sort of want to be ahead of that and not behind it. And in particular within that, I think we're very interested in kind of understanding the role private investors can play. And in particular, if you look at our clients who sort of collectively control tens of trillions of dollars of assets, and even a relatively small allocation of those investment pools to the region would be huge relative to the funding needs. What would it really take to unlock that? What's standing in the way, and what are the ingredients? Our organization's had like a collaboration with Larry Summers for a while. He introduced us to CGD. Our CEO is friends with Ajay. He got us involved in the World Bank. And then, interestingly, a lot of alumni, senior investors from Bridgewater have actually gone on to do things like VC, PE, or infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. We started by really talking to them, trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the various actors here, again, with this lens towards what role can private investment play? We think it can play a big role, and what would it take to actually unlock that? And then, I'd say a little bit kind of wrestling with this question of like, what is we at Bridgewater, given our capabilities and given our connections, is there something we can do to help accelerate that? And of course, that last part we say with a lot of humility. This is hard. We're new. What do we know? But we certainly want to understand and add something if we can. So that's a little bit on who we are. And then, kind of what I want to share is sort of from the eyes of private investors, when you talk to them, what are like the 4 big things that always come up as barriers to investing in the region and increasing their allocation to the region? So one is kind of these big cross-cutting macro risks, things like currency, things like political risk, things like inflation risk. And I'll say on these, kind of 2 things are true. One is, I do think for the average global investor who's 95+% of their portfolio is in developed world economies and they don't follow the region closely, for the average allocator, I think the risks are overstated in their head, the degree of these things and the worry to these things. At the same time, I do think I've seen bad analysis in the other direction of trying to rationalize away these things. I think the reality is somewhere in the middle, and I think it's just important to start by being objective and clinical about the state, and then from there you can say what's the right thing to do. So with that caveat, I'll kind of comment on probably the big 3. So probably the number 1 risk people highlight is currency risk, and you can see that big recent devaluations in places like Egypt and Nigeria. I do think it is interesting to actually take a country like Japan, that if, the FX has been extremely volatile and devalued, and if you take Japan and kind of put it on a spectrum of countries in Africa, it's probably somewhere in the middle in terms of its currency risk. So, it's easy to generalize and overstate, but I do think that thing is real, and I think investors really highlight that as a thing where they feel like they don't yet really know what to do with it. They don't yet feel like they have great vehicles to manage it. Second is, political risk. Where, again, I think things can be overstated. Like if you talk to the average investor in the region, they're not really worried about their factory being nationalized. That's a very dated concern. But there are things they're worried about, and I do think, like using political risk insurance is a part of being an investor there, and you need to know how to navigate those things. And I think universally they would say they love more of things like that. And then third, on inflation, I think this is a really interesting one where kind of this idea of hyperinflation looms large in people's heads. And if you just go look clinically, if you look at the largest economies in the region, it's been decades since there's been, unmanaged inflation. There's obviously higher inflation than there is in the developed world in a lot of these countries, though there is a spectrum across countries. But at the same time, like one of the big things I'm watching and thinking about is, how the debts get resolved. So you have huge external debts denominated in a currency they can't control. Depending on how that gets resolved, that risks reigniting inflationary dynamics. So that's sort of bucket one, is like these sort of big macro risks that I think loom large in people's heads, probably larger than they are, but also there's an element of realism too, and I think that deters people. The second is, sort of in a very obvious way, undeveloped infrastructure that makes it harder to, go there, set up a factory, et cetera. I think, in many ways, if you look at sort of wages in sub-Saharan Africa denominated in, the dollar, the euro, the yen, et cetera, it's extremely cheap and competitive. But then a lot of that is undercut by what it's actually like to try to set up a factory there or do business there. So, things like you need to have diesel generators because the electric grid's unreliable, or it can take 5 hours to get from one side of town to the other during rush hour, or it can take 40 days for minerals to make it support and things like that. Those things, sort of chip away at a lot of what otherwise looks like a very competitively priced labor pool. The third is, let's say a mix of institutions, governance, regulatory clarity. I was on a panel recently where I think someone put it very succinctly, where they said what companies need is clear rules enforced consistently, and I think that really does hit it well. Obviously some sets of rules are better than other sets of rules, but just this notion that make it extremely clear what the rules are, and whatever you're applying to me, you're applying to the guy across the street. That as a foundation really does go a long way. Like, companies will find all sorts of ways to operate in constrained environments if they sort of have that as a foundation. So obviously good governance is easier said than done, but it really is such a key thing. And then kind of the last big thing is, particularly when you talk to people in things like private equity and infrastructure, is, sort of the nature and the sophistication and the maturity of the capital markets, and how that's a limiting factor when trying to finance projects in regions like sub-Saharan Africa relative to the more developed countries. And it comes through in a couple of places. So one is, how developed are the credit pipes? So when someone saves, does that ultimately get recycled back into money that can then be used to finance investments? And then second is a little bit of, sort of if you're from the perspective of an international investor and a national allocator, what are the things that you really care about in order to feel comfortable allocating to the region? And it's things like, is there secondary market liquidity? How actively do the stocks trade? Even kind of mechanical things like, are you part of a major index, makes a huge difference. Like, a lot of allocators will invest if something's part of an index, passive flows, and even active flows are benchmarked. So the fact that they don't meet criteria like that really closes a lot of doors. So I think those are kind of the big things, and one of the big things on our mind is kind of putting ourselves in our shoes as investors who decide where we're going to manage money of our clients, and then also putting ourselves in our clients' shoes, who again are these major pools of capital, and even a small share of their portfolio being allocated to the region would be huge. Sort of what would it look like to bring those barriers down? What would it look like to improve those ingredients? And I think what you'd see is, as those barriers come down, as those ingredients improve, investment in the region would pick up. And I think the potential scale is enormous of what the private sector could do if it mobilized capital.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we'll transition to questions. Gargi, I wanted to start with you and pick up a little bit on right where you ended in your remarks. You said some of the most exciting conversations that you're having are in capitals around the world. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what is coming up in those discussions. What opportunities are you seeing that you are excited for the Gates Foundation to pursue? And what would you like to see more of?
Sure. So I guess two things, maybe picking up on what some of my colleagues have said. First, what I see happening now is really focused effort to invest in development progress in a fairly urgent way. Some of the most exciting pieces that we're engaged in are the transfer of what is working in some contexts to others. So let me give you an example. We've seen in India, I know you heard about this yesterday, the fairly significant economic and social effects of the digital stack. So ID, payment systems, combined with privacy and other strong regulation, that has had a huge effect on the efficiency of government-to-people transfers, on the ability of women, small businesses to connect to markets, connect to jobs and information. That is a system that we're seeing lots of countries, even ahead of the international community, decide to invest in as part of what they see as the future of growth and progress. So we have been supporting an Indonesian team to come sit with the Indian team. We partner with an organization called Co-Develop that is not sort of exporting the Indian model, but trying to replicate the core elements of that for different contexts in Africa. And so I think, while we often sort of ruminate about the bigger state of the world in Seattle, when we are actually seeing countries take action, don't have the choice, as Abe said, to sort of sit and ruminate. We are seeing really exciting investments like that. The second piece, I would say, it actually does come back to what's happening in advanced industrial economies. I really agree that we cannot take the rollback of aid budgets, the increase of trade barriers as given. And I think it's sort of a core, somebody said this yesterday, the original business of CGD was to think about how we influence the arguments in those countries, in our countries, to care about, to have greater concern for, and to see the mutual benefit of flows like aid, flows like development finance, which we need more of. And I think that needs to be something all of our institutions and more put our heads together and really remake the case.
That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned in your remarks and also that we talked about a little bit yesterday, this idea of policy windows or special moments of opportunity. Could you say a little bit more about how you think about identifying those and maybe what advice you would have for other actors in the space who are also looking for similar opportunities?
Yeah, thank you. So many of these moments are called the pivotal moment, called the critical junctures, usually realized after they have passed. For instance, like Sudan under Hamdok government was one of those moments where I think that international community failed them in not responding in time. And now we're left with a mess which is dealing with trying to mitigate the consequences of our failure not to engage in a moment, in a critical juncture. A deeper question is how do we create those moments, and that's mostly for domestic, for citizens of the country, for people with the agency. Outside actors should not. But at least try not to do harm, not standing in the way. There's a lot more that I think partly this is also not just in those moments, but when it comes to especially low-income countries and countries with fragility. Broadly, I think the international community has failed in responding effectively. And partly that is also undermining and not helping build local capacity. Bypassing, for instance, government structures, bypassing regular structures by creating parallel structures that further suck the oxygen out of the room, suck the talent out of the government structure, regular government structures. And yes, it is all donors want to be accountable, all donors want to have systems which are more and more less prone to corruption and more prone to, because they're in a fundamental sense, their accountability also lies with their local citizens. But in a way that we are trying to do it by creating parallel structures also undermines local capacity and makes the worst outcome more possible. That has happened in many, many countries. I also think that now that I have the floor, can I say a few more things?
Please, of course. You also react to any other comments that have been made?
What I said about research earlier, I still hold. I also think that what we need to do far more is system-level thinking, system-level research. We at FCDO try to do that. Land, who's not here, led the research on system-level education, thinking in education. Fantastic work. We need to do far more of that type of work, system-level work, in many, many other areas. We have only been able to do more. In just one or two areas, we at FCDO would want to do far more. I hope other actors can also do. Strong micro-founded research. also macro research, but which is also not just individual drivers, but is also about system thinking. I think that's quite critical, quite important. I also think there's a lot more that we could do, both UK, elsewhere in the world, in helping countries. In a world with geoeconomic fragmentation and with increasing protectionism, I think one of the things that we could do from the outside actors do have a role to play, is in helping countries develop more, like firms, countries, do more development of their exports, both through both goods and services. That's become increasingly more difficult over time. Yes, we've tried to provide more market access. The US has AGWA. We in the UK have the Development Country Trading Scheme, but that alone is not sufficient. So what we need is far more active measures in terms of like helping countries and firms to promote their exports. And there are many other issues I could talk about, but I'll wait for the next round.
Okay, to pass the proverbial mic, an open-ended question of any reactions to any of the comments so far. And then I also wanted to pick up on one thing you mentioned around this drifting that you described between policymakers and international institutions. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what kind of bridging you think is warranted in response.
Thanks. So a couple of reactions. When you were describing all of the things that it was going to take to get significant private investment to flow, I was struck by, again, this is exactly the problem, I think, that we want countries to be what they're not are. So if you want, a macro environment that's perfect, there are some countries that have it, but that don't. And then to also fix the energy sector, to have clear rules, etc. That's exactly what countries are not able to do. No? And often we have gone to these countries with kind of a wish list of what needs to be done, exactly to cater for private investment or external investment. Which has not been forthcoming because it's never quite ideal. And I think this is a little bit about kind of countries drifting away from us. And I think, we have to go back to brass tacks, as it were, and really instead be making the case about what it's going to take for domestic investment, which is very low, to go up 2, 3, 4 percentage points more. And that will have a lot more dividend, both in terms of better development outcomes, but also growth in the long run than chasing the proverbial, external savings that are going to come and save Africa. So I think a little bit kind of, shifting the conversation and thinking about the proximate changes that need to be made to facilitate domestic investment. The guy that's got a small garage to grow to expand. Is the financing constraint? Is it red tape? I think I would love to see a focus on those kind of things, and I think that is one thought that I have. Second. On kind of the international environment and what can be done. Kristalina, our managing director, always likes to make the point that the creation of the IMF and World Bank, particularly this year, which marks the 80th anniversary of the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, that the international community got together to create these institutions out of enlightened self-interest. And of course, the whole idea behind aid budgets, the architecture that we had was also on the back of enlightened self-interest. But the self-interest part, I think, is missing. We have to appeal to that. If there's one thing the pandemic has taught us, just how interconnected we are. We see the migration flows that are roiling countries, in Europe in particular, but also here. How making sure that conditions in countries remain as good as they can be is important. But all the more so, I think, at this time when out of geopolitical considerations, other considerations, where countries have become inward-looking and are putting up trade barriers. or other kind of changes like this. The European Union is coming up with this carbon border adjustment mechanism, etc., which countries in developing countries are very worried about. They don't, even if it's in reality it will not be increasing transaction costs, trading costs for them. They are worried about what it is that the intention of policymakers in advanced countries are. I cannot tell you the number of questions I get about the U.S.'s industrial policy. Why shouldn't we be doing that internally? Are the kind of questions that are being done. So at a time when kind of the countries have become inward-looking, advanced countries have become inward-looking, I think it's all the more important to continue thinking about what can be done to engage policymakers in the region and that their interests are being taken into account. And then one last thing I want to appeal to, or put the case for, even if we're not going to see a reversal of the cuts in aid budgets that we have seen for long-term development financing. At a minimum, we have to do more to do better than the cuts that are taking place to humanitarian budgets right now. And that is one of the most heart-wrenching things. The same countries that have these huge development challenges are also being hit by refugee flows. I was in Chad a year ago, and the government is spending so much money accommodating 500,000 refugees from the war in Sudan. And UN agencies, the government itself is not getting, aid budgets, humanitarian assistance is being cut, and more of it falling on the back of the Chadian government, or even worse, local people who are getting together and actually providing support. This is, I think, crazy in the world that we are in right now.
Makes sense, thank you. Okay, Devin, over to you. Again, open-ended prompt to respond to anything that you heard. And then I wanted to pick up actually on something that we were chatting about right before the panel started, that Bridgewater's competitors don't seem to be doing what you're envisioning at scale. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you see Bridgewater bringing to the table and how that might be differentiated among other actors in the space.
Great, yeah. So I'll react quickly. I think you made two really great points. I think it's totally right that part of the puzzle is you have to meet countries where they are, not as you'd want them to be. And then also within that recognize, huge variation among countries, and there are places where, in sectors where certain types of investment are more feasible for the private sector and things are more suitable, and places where, it's less, and it's important to avoid generalizing. And I think your point about domestic savings really resonated as well. I think one thing I think is really interesting if you look at sort of some of the East Asian productivity miracles of the past 40 years, places like China, Vietnam, there's obviously a lot of drivers to those successes, but one is that they had unbelievably high domestic savings rate that got recycled into unbelievably high domestic investment. I think that was definitely part of the puzzle there, and one of the big learnings. And then I think in terms of what we're trying to figure out, I'd say it's really early days. So I want to caveat with that. But the thing I'm interested in is this idea of if you sort of kind of take this idea that, man, there's huge piles of money in these global institutional investors. And in many ways, many of them actually have an axe or an interest in investing in the region. So you look at a lot of the Northern European sovereign wealth funds and pension funds sort of have these very explicit, alongside return and risk, also development mandates. And is there sort of a way to make it as easy as possible for them to invest in, say, places like Sub-Saharan Africa? And I think the reality is that organizations like these can be every bit as bureaucratic, and as you can sort of kind of go through what is it like to navigate an organization like this, and there might be interest in investing somewhere, but it's like, well, there's a private equity team, but it's only allowed to invest in developed world countries. Then there's an emerging markets team, but they're only allowed to invest in things in the index. So even if they have sort of like an organizational goal to help finance development, there's like often those things can sort of die in these very practical things of, okay, can we actually find a place for this thing to live? And they have other challenges too, like, short-termism, like it's not like a lot of managers are assessed on their 3-year rolling performance and things like that, makes it hard to invest for the very long term. So the thing I'm interested in is, and then on the other hand, you sort of have this reality too of, there's sort of like a high fixed cost to getting your head into, I'm going to make a private equity investment in Kenya or Cote d'Ivoire, where I've never made an investment before. But because those capital markets are small, it might be a small investment, like $50 million, and it's very hard to sort of get over that fixed cost hurdle of getting your head around what does it mean to invest in a place you've never invested before for a thing that's going to be a rounding error in the grand scheme of your portfolio. So I do think things that can kind of figure out ways to sort of one, like start with people who already know what it feels like to do private equity infrastructure on the continent, figure out ways to sort of take what they're doing, like pool that, and create sort of structures and vehicles that feel very, very familiar to the large pools of capital who otherwise have interest in it. And that I think there could be something really powerful in trying to bridge the capital, huge piles of money in the world, getting to people who know what to do with it, and sort of overcome some of these like little logistical obstacles you have on the way. And I think the reason that I'm interested in giving organization is just a lot of what we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to understand these organizations, put ourselves in their shoes and their constraints. Obviously, a big question on it is always like, what's the where are we going to bring something unique to all the all the other work that's going on? But I'm quite interested in that because it just does feel like you kind of do the simple math of like, even if you take just Bridgewater's clients, it's like they control tens of trillions of dollars, and you say, well, what if they put 1% or 2%, and suddenly those numbers look really, really big relative to the investment gaps.
Makes sense. Okay, so at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. Okay, this is going to be hard. So, gentleman right here. Gentleman. Oh, sorry. Over here. Yes. So we'll take those three, and then we'll do another round. So maybe let's start over here and work our way back.
Good. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the issue of systems thinking and to apply this to the disjointed way we think about trade policy. Because I think this is something that really has not been discussed in the how of how to do growth. It has come up, of course. I think even Emily, in your opening remarks, you talked about AGOA, and that has come up yesterday. It came up in the context of aligning trade policy with industrial policy and so on. But because trade policy can also be very technical, what I find is that it tends not really to be interrogated in the way that it should be in thinking about growth. So let me give you some examples. Adnan pointed out that the UK has this development country trading scheme for the poorest countries, correct. However, our research I've been involved in also shows that the UK, after Brexit, was very quick to replicate the EU's free trade agreement. So with countries like Kenya, which is in a customs union that is trying to grow that market in East Africa for scale and all these things that we talked about, or for Ghana, Nigeria, of course, refused to sign an EPA with the UK, but Kenya, Ghana, and so on. What we find is that the UK is undermining these efforts of these countries to grow these regional markets through these reciprocal free trade agreements that it has with these countries. But at the same time, the UK is one of the strongest supporters of the AFCFTA, UK investment for manufacturing. We know the story and so on, but just that disconnect between the development side and the trade side really should cause for systems thinking indeed. I'll give you a second example. Of course, at the level of the WTO, we know the problems, with the Doha round, that agriculture discussions have not moved and so on. But again, research I've been involved in is showing that it's having an effect on the extent of investment in agriculture in various African countries. Take a couple of products, to be very specific here. What we found for rice, that there is effect of price suppression because of the subsidies. And this is not just by rich countries, even countries like India, through its public stockholding program, we're seeing that the effect on its subsidies and the ripple effect for producing rice in African countries at a time when the urban population in many African countries is, rice is becoming an important staple. We found the same for wheat. We found the same for maize. The only exceptions were yam and cassava, which mainly consumed in African countries that are not subsidized outside of Africa. third example I'll give you, we talked about this briefly yesterday, is that yes, trade flows between countries of the global south is increasing, but outside of any policy framework for this, which is very worrying. UNCTAD made an effort at the beginning of the century through what it's called the GSTP, not to be confused with the GSP. The GSTP, again, this is the nano aspect of trade policy. The GSTP stands for the Generalized System of Trade Preferences, not the Generalized System of Preferences, which is what rich countries give to poor countries. But the GSTP was meant to provide a policy framework for countries of the South to come together, have a framework for trade and so on. That never took off, the political will, the appetite, and so on. And many countries complain of dumping from other countries of the South. If you take any African country, they complain about dumping from China, from India, from Turkey, and so on, and particularly in sectors that they could potentially be competitive. So my point is just simply to say that really we do need systems thinking in the way that we relate trade policy to development and growth more broadly. And I'm not seeing that happening as such. I'm quite pleased to hear that, of course, the UK government being very strapped, as we all know, but I'm quite pleased to hear the review that Minu Shafik is leading. Perhaps there could be scope to contribute to that in some way. Thank you.
So we'll take 3, and then I'll let each of the panelists respond. So while that mic is moving, maybe we could move to the gentleman over here, and then we'll come back to you just as the third.
Thank you so much. So I'm Thomas from Malawi. I head the National Planning Commission there. And when I listen to the panel, one of the things that comes to mind is somehow the disconnect between what is really down on the ground and what the funders seem to be focusing on. If you look at countries like Malawi, you would find that a lot more times the funders want to emphasize support on the social sectors. Now, the social sectors are important, don't get me wrong, but they don't generate resources. Countries like ours would want to emphasize a lot more on domestic resource mobilization that can help us to sustainably fund the social sectors. But a lot more times that doesn't happen. A lot more of the funders are looking at supporting that. And I'll give you an example that in a time like 2006, when Malawi was part of those countries that had debt relief, we advised that most of those resources have to go to education, health, water, and sanitation. And that's where we spent most of those resources. And not long after that, we are back to begging because we did not invest in the sectors that are supposed to generate resources for the country to move forward. So I think that a lot more of these funders, especially the philanthropies, you look at how they even bypass government systems to work with NGOs, non-government organizations, and the public sector institutions remain very weak. And because they are so weak, they are becoming inefficient. Because of inefficiencies, they become more corrupt. Because one wants to bypass the systems, and for you to get the services faster, you've got to find a way of getting those services faster. So I think the model in terms of how the funders, it's like the assumption that the authorities don't know what they want. They look at Africa as one that is needing charity, where you need, you don't have enough health, you don't have enough water and sanitation, you are dying of hunger, and therefore this is what we want to help you with. But you cannot, for example, fund an industrial policy that can then help these countries to grow. We are spreading these little resources because we just want to be seen as making impact in short term, but the growth is a long-term project. We've got to help these countries to mobilize resources on their own and have policies and programs that can sustainably support the social sectors over time, which is not what I see the funders doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, last third question here, and then I'll let each of the panelists respond in turn.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. My father was the Economist sub-editor for Ending Poverty, but also von Neumann's biographer. And I have a feeling that we may not be talking about growth for the right thing. Back in 1984, Dad and I wrote this book where we were basically counting back the livelihoods of the millennial generation, if millennials were to be the first renewable generation. And we thought only about 1 billion of the 4 billion jobs of millennials would be like the industrial age. We'd have maybe 1 billion which were very far green, because perhaps half of all nations don't have any critical minerals, so they're always going to be disadvantaged unless we do have a green economy model. 1 billion might be very much more community, family, safety, happiness, and then 1 billion with technology. In my father's last couple of years, he met Muhammad Yunus, and the thing which was amazing was that both Muhammad Yunus and Fazli Abed had developed models which were, women empowerment, bottom-up community. So what I'm very interested in right at this moment with my friends and Muhammad Yunus is to challenge someone like Jensen Huang to develop an LLM model from the bottom of the pyramid, bottom 2 million women, 2 billion women empowerment models, so that we can actually see that intelligence and see if that works.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll let the panelists, I think, respond to the parts of the question that they feel most apply to them. So yeah, please, Gary.
Sure. Well, maybe I will take Thomas's question. I am conscious that Ken Apollo has critiqued us for the opposite of what you did, Thomas, in the sense of working too much with government. Why don't we work around government with more private sector systems? So that actually resonates more. Almost everything we do relies on the primary healthcare system, on the ag extension system. So we are, for us, working at scale, getting out of the nano into impact at scale, transforming sectors has required strong partnership with government. You're absolutely right, though, that we focus on the sectors where we know the business and are not working across every part of the economy. I think, if I could reflect on one aspiration for going forward, it is that there is a little bit more differentiation among the funders so that everyone isn't sort of faddishly doing the same thing, but we do have a more holistic way to partner with the concerns of a planning ministry, for example. Last thing I would say, in part, though sort of 75% of our work is focused on social, human development sectors. We have actually, over time, grown our engagement with governments on the domestic fiscal picture, as Abe knows very well. On domestic resource mobilization, not so much on the policy front, that is not our area, but on the mechanics, for example, of digitizing government as a way to increase revenue. We are deeply engaged on the debt aspects, but for us that actually is a necessary outgrowth of working in the human development sector, because progress won't happen, as you're saying, without unlocking some fiscal space or the potential to grow in a broader way. So we've been pulled into that area. We'll be a small player, but I really agree that it hasn't been enough to only focus on human development. It will be our niche, that the delivery of development progress will be our focus, but we are absolutely part of the broader concern now of sort of growth and fiscal space.
Yes, so 2 quick comments on the first and second questions. So on the first, yes, you're right. I agree with this thrust of your comment. While UK and other countries have preferential access for developing countries, there has also been a process of preference erosion in recent areas because of free trade agreement, bilateral and other trade agreements. That's an area of very active discussion here. I think the counter argument that is posed is, while we had preferential access, much of that access was never utilized in the first place. So the question is, what is stopping that from happening? Should we continue with the same way of preferential access, or should we also think of active measures to promote exports or other measures, correct local farms to international farms? As I said, very active area of discussion. If you have thoughts on this, so please do share. That will strengthen our internal discussions. So on the second, yes, I completely agree with the thrust of the argument. I think the key thing to think about is reimagine how we think about growth and development and move away from a concept of charity to more of investments. And think of Africa also. I think the increasing demography in Africa is not to be dreaded, but also to be seen in a world where we have like falling demography, fertility in many other parts of the world, as seen as an asset, as a human capital, as a source of like human talent that is to be celebrated. I think the key question is what Abby said: how do we invest in health and education? How do we invest in building that human capital? Let me stop.
Yeah, so maybe I'll also react to Thomas's question. I think, and I would want to make a distinction between what happens on budget and what happens off budget. So there has, in general, been for countries like Malawi, other low-income countries, the amount of budget support has been declining. But still the case that in Malawi, probably 3/4, 2/3 of spending is financed by domestic revenues, right? Taxes, and it's only really the quarter that is financed by borrowing increasingly, and less by concessional financing, and almost zero grants these days. So to my mind, I think first I'm always struck by just how much governments have so much agency and don't use it. So as I said, 3/4 of the budget, probably a bit more, is being financed by domestic revenues. So the government should be dictating how it's allocating those resources. Okay, because the lion's share is coming from government. Now, that's a general point I wanted to make to you. On the broader point about what the international community can do to strengthen Malawi, of course, one unfortunate thing is that increasingly governments aid has been drifting away from going into budgets and instead going more to projects. The gap being filled increasingly by borrowing. So I think that's something that's really incumbent upon the funding agencies to rethink about. Again, 20 years ago, the whole idea about the Development Compact was more and more resources being channeled through budgets, which are going to be going through increasingly parliamentary scrutiny, public process. Now, I think that's been abandoned, and aid budgets have been cut, but also what remains is increasingly outside the process, and of course, resulting in countries having to borrow and exacerbating the debt challenge. So that's the challenge I see. But I think we underestimate just how much agency is within governments, and the need to be a bit more aggressive on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have a ton to add. I mean, I do think your point on domestic resources is totally right, just factually in terms of what a big share that plays in financing in these countries, and as well as sort of the government side. And I think I'm also interested in the idea of creating structures and this idea that domestic savings can also be recycled into domestic investment, and that's another huge pool of domestic resources that can be mobilized. Because I agree, the reality is, if you look at it, I think one of the most impactful things that people on the stage can do is kind of like set the wheels in motion that allow countries to, through their own capital markets, through their own tax bases, to finance those things. And I think that gets you to more this notion of investment versus charity that I think is really powerful. So yeah, I think your point's really, really well said.
Great. Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and then maybe we could do a rapid fire round. So
Thank you. This question might be partly aimed at Thomas from Malawi, but would be interested to hear the funders' responses as well. Honestly, a lot of what USAID has been pivoting to do in the economic space is actually exactly what you just laid out, which I think should be very obvious to all of us, that domestic resource mobilization and supporting the growth that you need in order to have those resources to actually be able to fund your own services rather than funders funding those services in perpetuity. I feel like that logic's very obvious. Maybe the organizers may have planted you in the crowd to say what you said, but I think part of the gap for us is kind of thinking through how, as USAID or others here, how can we support those, let's say, strategies for economic transformation, and like, what is the mechanism for that? Is it most helpful for us to be trying to have like technical assistance, to have embedded advisors in Malawi or elsewhere? I think a lot of times funders end up doing these analyses to say, here's the constraints to growth, and then here you go. So would love to hear from the funders, and maybe Thomas, what you think funders can really do to sort of bridge that gap.
Could you pass the mic to Thomas in case you'd like to reply? And no pressure, but I'll let yeah, Thomas, why don't you go first, and then we'll have the panel.
I know she's put me on the spot.
Yes, I'm sorry.
But I think the issue is that the countries like Malawi have have defined their growth pathways. We, for example, in Malawi, we have a vision that has been clearly set out on wealth creation and self-reliance. And it's got defined strategies on how to get there. One of the four areas is we want to make sure that we promote agriculture, tourism, mining, and tourism, ATMM. But in that, we need economic infrastructure to support that, ICT, transport, energy, and so on. And the policies that have to support that. So when we engage USAID, FCDO, and so on and so forth, oftentimes we're told, look, we already have a strategy that is spanning between now to 20 whatever. Our focus is on health and education and stuff like that. I think we need to be able to look at the countries that we're supporting and cut our support based on what the priorities of those countries are. So to me, the key issue is to have effective engagement with authorities in terms of what is it that you would want us to support you with in terms of moving forward, instead of just continuing business as usual. Because this is what we do in other countries, so Malawi is not going to be an exception. And even the language of wealth creation in Malawi is becoming a lingua. We no longer talk about poverty reduction because we don't believe that the communities are going to really move forward if we continue to give them handouts and stuff like that, because the mentality of poverty reduction is something we want to go away with. We need to be creating wealth so that we can fund our development agenda on our own. Thank you.
Great. We are at time, so I actually suggest that we wrap here and we continue the discussion in the break. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the people who asked questions. We have a 30-minute break now, so people should head outside, have some coffee and food, and then we'll be back here at 11. Thank you very much.